So Heather was on her way home from work one evening, and she gave me a call, and she said, "Honey, I'm lost. Can you help me find my way home?" And I asked her what had happened, and what it was is there was a wreck out on the highway, and the police had directed all the traffic off the highway and onto the back roads, and she was on some roads that she had never seen before. And so I said, "Well, hang on. Let me pull up the Life 360 app and let me see where you are." And I'm not certain if you're familiar or not with the Life 360 app, but it's an app that we use in our family so that we can look at where each other is at. It's a location map app that shows a map and shows where you're at. But it's one of those things where when a situation like this happens, you can kind of look it up and panic together, kind of thing. But so I started giving her directions on how to get home, and she started to get a little confused about it, and she kept asking me, "Honey, where are you taking me?" She says, "Honey, your directions don't make any sense." And I could see from my vantage point that, perhaps from where she was at, it didn't make a lot of sense, but from where I was at, it did make a lot of sense. I could tell exactly where she was and which way she needed to get home, or which way she needed to go to get home. And so I kept saying, I told her, I said, "Heather, trust me, I got you on this. I'm going to get you home." And so, the next intersection came up. I said, "Take a right here." And the next one came up. I said, take a left here. And eventually I got her home. And all of a sudden I became her knight in shining armor. And she gave me a big kiss and, hugged me real tight and said, "Oh, that was the most horrible thing I've ever experienced in my life. I'm glad you were there." And she cooked me a big steak. And no, none of that last stuff happened. But I did get her home. But this morning, I want to talk to you about what holiness looks like when life doesn't make sense. Because there are seasons in a Christian's life where they say, "God, I'm trusting you, but this isn't what I expected." Or "God, I'm following you, but the direction that this is all going, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me." We've been in the book of Psalms for this sermon series that we're in. Today we're going to be hearing from a man named Asaph. He writes a psalm in Psalms. It's Psalm 73. He writes 12 psalms in the book of Psalms, but the one that we're going to look at today is the one he wrote in Psalm 73. And in Psalm 73, Asaph grapples with some of life's hardest questions. But instead of giving into frustration, he chooses to guard his heart, and he chooses to let go and let God shape his life and shape his faith. And what he discovers is this: holiness keeps walking with Jesus while you wait for things to make sense. Holiness keeps walking with Jesus while you wait for things to make sense. So let's go ahead and turn together to Psalm 73, if you will. Turn there with me. In this psalm, you can tell right away that Asaph, he loves God wholeheartedly, but he's in this season of life where there's some things happening and he just doesn't understand it. He doesn't get what's going on. And the main issue really is, he's struggling in his faith. Things are happening to him and his friends and his families, people who are following, people who are following God. And what he doesn't realize, or what he doesn't understand is why is the wicked seeming to get ahead while the righteous seem to be falling behind? And that doesn't make sense to him. But I love the progression that we see in this psalm. Asaph goes from this moment at the beginning of the psalm where he's very confused about everything that is happening in his life, and then God takes him through this kind of this progression where he goes from being very confused about it to this moment of clarity. And that's what we're going to see as we walk through this psalm together. We're going to see him going from a a place of confusion to a place of clarity. So this morning, I want to walk us through 4 things that God does when life doesn't make sense. The first one has to do with our heart. And when your heart's wounded, you can get some blind spots. And that's what this first one deals with, because when you are in this time in your life when things don't make sense, you've got to recognize those blind spots. And that's what God helps you with right out of the gate. He helps you to recognize your blind spots. This is our first feeling. He helps you to recognize your blind spots. Asaph calls out his blind spots right here at the beginning of this, in the first 3 verses. He says this. He says, "Surely God is good to Israel, to those who are pure in heart. But as for me, my feet had almost slipped. I had nearly lost my foothold, for I envisioned the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked." Now, did you catch that? Asaph says, I almost lost my footing because I was focusing more on other people and less on God. Ever walked maybe in a store or maybe through the house and you're looking at your cell phone and you quit paying attention and you run into something? Have you ever done that? Somebody ran into me the other day. I was in Walmart. I was pushing my golf cart. They came out of the aisle and just hit me right on the side. And I looked up and they were looking at their cell phone. They weren't paying attention. But that happens. And that's what happened to Asaph. He kept focusing more on other people, and it distracted him. It kept him from focusing on God. And because of that, he lost his footing. And right here, Asaph reveals one of the biggest blind spots for any wounded believer. It's when you start watching others and you stop waiting on God. That's a blind spot. It's a blind spot. It's when you start watching others and you stop waiting on God. And that's what Asaph is doing here. He says, I almost lost my footing in this. I almost slipped in my walk with God because I started focusing on other people. And he goes into a lot of detail on what he saw in these other people. These are the wicked people that he thinks are getting ahead, right? He says these wicked people that are getting ahead, they have no struggles. Their bodies are healthy and strong. They don't carry the burdens like I do. And here's the thing, is this is what he thinks he's seeing when he's looking at all these other people, but he's not seeing it right. He's not seeing it correctly. And we're going to see that later on in the psalm where, the light bulb goes off and he says, you know what, I wasn't seeing this right. When I saw these people, I saw all these good things that were happening in their lives. And I was thinking, I'm struggling with God. Why are they getting by okay and I'm struggling with God, And here's the thing. He's not seeing what God sees. He's not seeing what God sees. But, we look at that and we have to ask ourselves, how often do we do the same thing? I mean, I'm guilty of this, and I'm sure you are too. I mean, just get on Facebook, right? We scroll through Facebook, and everyone looks like they're living these happy, healthy, picture-perfect lives, right? And you're following God, and you're like, why is everything going so great with them, and why am I going through all my stuff, right? You say, I'm living for Jesus. Why isn't my life like their life? And why isn't my life picture perfect? And here's the thing, is a lot of times we're not seeing what God sees. We're just seeing those good, moments that are pictured on the screen, and we're not seeing what's underneath. A lot of times we see the surface, but God always sees what's underneath. And for Asaph, this becomes a spiritual blind spot for him, because the more he looked at them, the less he listened to God and leaned on him. And he started to recognize how this was tripping up his faith. This was causing him to lose his footing, his grounding, his anchor in his walk with God. And so what he does next is the best thing for any of us to do when we have blind spots or we have something going on in our lives. This is where things really begin to change. What he does, he takes all of this that is pent up inside him, all this frustration, all this, this blurry vision, his blind spot. He takes all of it and he gives it to God. He takes it to God. And this leads us to number 2. When he takes it to God, God invited him to refocus. Refocus. And that's what he does for us. God invites you to refocus. Over the holidays, a friend of ours took a family photo of us. We asked them to take a picture, and they took the picture, and then we looked at it, and they took this perfect, beautiful picture of themselves. They flipped the camera the wrong way. Somehow they hit the button that pointed it back to them. You know how those phones do, it pointed it back to them. And they took this, perfect picture of themselves. And we're like, well, that wasn't the picture that we were looking for. We wanted a picture of us. And so we had to, reset, and they did it again. But the camera wasn't pointed in the right direction. And that's exactly what was happening in Asaph's heart. His life was focused on the wrong thing. Like I mentioned before, it was just simply focused on the wrong thing. But now, here's what he does. He takes it to God, and God points his heart back in the right direction. And listen to what he says. He says this, and it's in verse 16. He says, when I tried to understand everything that I was grappling with, it troubled me deeply. And of course it troubled him, right? When your heart's not pointing in the right direction, nothing looks right. But then look what happens next. I think this is the best part of the chapter right here. He says this. He says, everything didn't make sense to me. Everything troubled me. I wasn't seeing things clearly. But then he says, in the next part of this verse, he says, but then I entered into the sanctuary of God. He gets in God's presence. And look at this. He says, I entered the sanctuary of God, and then what happens? It's like the light bulb goes off. It's like I all of a sudden started to see what God sees. I began to understand that their final destiny wasn't that great. See, his focus, it flipped. He turned his heart in the right direction. And I really want you to think about this, because the breakthrough that we're seeing here in this chapter, it didn't happen because God answered all of his questions. It happened because Asaph made the decision to step into God's presence. And for him, that's all he needed. He just needed to realign his heart and reposition himself to where he was with God. And that's why holiness doesn't begin with understanding. Holiness begins with entering God's presence. It begins when you are with God. You're walking with him, and you're leaning on him, and you're listening to him, and you're learning from him. That's where holiness begins. It doesn't mean that you're going to have all your questions answered. It doesn't mean that life is going to all of a sudden make sense. It means that you are going to go through whatever you're going through with him. And here's the beautiful thing, is over time, it doesn't happen immediately, but over time, things get clearer and clearer, not because you're trying to figure it all out on your own strength or your own wisdom. It's because God is leading you in the direction you need to go in. And things get clearer and clearer as you walk with him. And so here's what I want you to grasp. When life doesn't make sense, God isn't asking you to figure it out. Are you with me? He's not asking you to figure it out. He's not asking you to fix it. I know I'm a fix-it person. I'm preaching to myself on this one. I'm a fix-it person. When something isn't right or something doesn't make sense, I just want to go fix it. God's not asking you to fix it. He's not asking you to pretend everything's fine. See, all he's asking you is to take it and give it to him. Give it to him. Surrender it to him. Believe him and trust him that he is going to make everything right. And he is still good and he is still at work in your life. Right? Refocusing your heart, it's not ignoring reality, it's inviting God into it. It's inviting God into it. And when Asaph refocused his heart on God, he started, over time, he started to see clearly again. And here's what he saw. He noticed, when he saw it through God's lens, when he saw it the way God saw it, he started to realize that the wicked people that seemed to be getting ahead, they were not as picture perfect as it seemed on the surface. He began to realize that. And most importantly, he realized that God was not walking with the wicked. God was walking with him. And that's what mattered. That's what mattered. God was walking with him. And Asaph realized in that moment, as he's talking about his journey through this psalm, he noticed in that moment that being with God, that's all he needed. We have to internalize that and accept that. Sometimes being with Jesus is enough. It's enough. And it's all I need. And Asaph realized that. And at that point, Asaph, he took his eyes off others and he put his eyes back on God. And look at what God does next. This is number 3. God revealed truth to him. God revealed truth to him. He reveals what's really true. He revealed truth to him. And again, look at this progression. You've got Asaph. He's taken his fears to God. He's taken his frustrations to God. He's taken his questions. And even in verse 16, he says, none of this makes sense. Did you see that in verse 16? He says, none of this made sense because he was focusing on others and not on God. And he says, when he was doing that, none of this made sense. But now, listen to what he says in verse 18. After he goes to the sanctuary, after he goes to the place where he can meet with God and be in his presence, he takes it to God. He puts it on the altar of prayer. And in verse 18, he says, surely you place them on slippery ground. Do you see? At first he said, man, I was on slippery ground. But then everything came to light. And he says, but now I've realized, you've placed them on slippery ground. In fact, you cast them down to ruin. How suddenly are they destroyed, completely swept away by terrors. And if you look at that is such a powerful shift, church. That is such a powerful shift. Asaph is saying, Lord, I thought I was the one slipping. But now I see it clearly. I see that the wicked ones, they're the ones that don't have any footing at all. We tend to see things from the perspective of the season we're in. Hear me closely, because this is faith and reality. This is the real stuff here. We tend to see things from the perspective of the season we're in. In good seasons, everything feels right. Our perspective seems clear, right? It feels good. But in hard seasons, no matter what's happening in the other parts of your life, if you're in a hard season, your perspective, it looks hard, it looks heavy, it looks crowded. We tend to see things from the perspective of the season we're in. But here's the thing I want to share. God doesn't just see the season you're in. He sees the whole story of your life. In other words, we see the now. God sees the end. His perspective on things is a lot different than ours, isn't it? And as for me, you know, when I come to the end of my story, I want people to be able to look back on my life and say, you know, I could see God at work in him and J.J. I could see God at work in him in the hard seasons and in the good seasons. See, because God's at work in both seasons. He's at work in both seasons. He's at work in the good seasons, and he's at work in the not so good seasons. He's at work in those hard seasons of life. And see, here's the thing. No matter what I'm going through, no matter what my circumstance is, I want my life to point back to him. And that's what holiness looks like when life doesn't make sense. Holiness isn't always certain. This is your next feeling. Holiness isn't always certain, but it stays confident in the one who sees what we can't. Are you following me? Holiness is saying, Lord, I don't understand this, but I'm not going to let my confusion rewrite what I know about you. I'm not going to allow my confusion to cloud my vision from understanding how good your grace really is. Because no matter what, God is faithful. And God is good. And he provides. No matter what. He's gracious. And I'm not going to let my confusion rewrite what I know is true about God and his grace and his goodness at work in my life. Let me give you some truths you can anchor yourself to. 4 truths. The first one is this. God is always, everyone say the word always with me. You ready? Always. God is always good. Even when life isn't. He's still good. Amen? He's still good. Here's the next truth, and we need to anchor this. These are truths we anchor ourselves to, especially in those times when you're going through uncertainty or you're going through things in your life that you don't understand. This is the next one. God is near. God is near, even when you don't feel him. His character doesn't change according to our feelings. You with me? His character doesn't change. He is near. He is near. And I've said this every sermon in the series. I'm going to say it again. God always moves towards the broken. Do you believe that? He moves towards the broken. God is near, even when you don't feel him. Next one's actually a fill-in here. It's God sees the whole story. We only see the chapter we're in. That's true, isn't it? We only see the chapter we're in. And then the last one, another anchor truth here. God knows what is ultimately good for you. And if you look closely, you'll see that all these truths and more are packed into this psalm. And when Asaph comes to the end of this psalm, he shares a truth that we can all lean on, especially in seasons of brokenness, in those seasons when life doesn't make sense. And it's number 4, God helps you rest in his faithfulness. God helps you rest in his faithfulness. There's this beautiful shift in this psalm. Earlier, Asaph, he says, I was losing my footing, my feet almost slipped, but then look what he says now in verse 23. He says, yet in all this, I've realized something. He says, I'm with you, and you're with me in this. And look at this next line here in verse 23. He says, and I've realized you hold me by my right hand, and you guide me with your counsel. And afterwards, you're going to take me to glory, to be with you. That's the hope he's holding on to. And he's resting in that There's things happening in his life. He doesn't go in the details of what's happening in his life to cause him to ask these questions and grapple with these things that he's grappling with. He doesn't go into that because it doesn't matter. What matters is that he's with God and God's with him, and he's realized that, and God's helping him. He can rest in that. And then look at verse 25. It says, "Whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire besides you." If you lost everything, would your walk with Jesus be good enough? And that's what he's saying. This world has nothing to offer me. He says, my flesh, my heart fall and fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Church family, that's no longer the voice of a confused heart. That's the voice of a rested heart. And Asaph realized that even when he thought he was slipping, God was with him the whole time, holding him up the whole time. And think about this. He's no longer comparing himself to other people. He's no longer scrolling through Facebook saying, how come they're living perfect lives and I'm not? He's not comparing any longer. He's not complaining. He's not confused any longer. What he is he's content. He's content. And here's the holiness connection. Holiness doesn't rest in circumstances. Holiness rests in God's faithfulness. Holiness says, Lord, I may not understand what I'm walking through, but I know you're walking through it with me. And that's good enough. That's good enough. Holiness rests in the God who not only guides you step by step, but a God who holds you up and helps you so you won't slip. And that's Asaph. Asaph, he begins the psalm with confusion. He ends it with confidence. He begins this psalm with anxiety. He ends it with assurance. He begins this psalm looking around at other people, and he ends it looking up to him. Church family, that's holiness. That's holiness. Holiness keeps walking with Jesus while you wait for things to make sense. That's holiness. And can I tell you something? Sometimes the deepest work God does in your life, it happens before. It happens before the answers come. That deep work that God's doing in your life, it happens before the answers come. It happens before you get clarity. And it happens before your circumstances change. I said this last week. I want to say it again. God does his best work in the valley. We love the mountaintop. I love the mountaintop. I love to get on the mountain and say, look at what God's done. This is amazing. But if you look at Scripture, the work happens in the valley. God does his best work in the valley. And sometimes the real miracle is that your feet didn't slip when everything around you felt slippery. It's because God did something in your life. He kept you anchored. He kept you where you needed to be in your walk with him. And that's what matters. And so when you find yourself on the back roads of your faith, you know, all of a sudden something happens and life doesn't make sense, and you know you're trying to navigate something that you've never seen or a place you've never been, don't give in to frustration. Don't give in to frustration. Call on Jesus, and he'll get you through it. Call on Jesus. He'll get you through it. Because just like I could see Heather on Life 360, He can see every part of your life. He sees where you are. He sees where you have been. He sees where you're going and where He wants to take you next. And He can clearly help you to take your next step in your faith with Him. And He'll get you home. He'll get you home. We don't always see the bigger picture, do we? But God does. God does. And He can take any confusion in your life and He can bring clarity to it. And that's holiness. You know, when life doesn't make sense, holiness doesn't give up. It looks up. And it steps forward. And it trusts that God sees the whole story. And He's going to lead you in the next step that He wants you to take in your walk with Him.